Yeah, got it. Okay, so hi everyone. Good afternoon to one and all. I hope we are all doing well at this time of the semester. So welcome to the CFPR Lunchtime Seminar. And today I'm pleased to welcome our speaker, Professor Ming Wen from the University of Hong Kong. So please allow me to say a few words about her before we start. Prof. Wen started her academic career at the University of Utah in 2003, where she rose through the academic ranks to become full professor in 2013 and chaired the Department of Sociology from 2015 to 2021. In the fall of 2022, she joined the University of Hong Kong as the Dean of Social Sciences. And Prof. Wen is also deputy editor of the Journal of Social and Behavioral Science, which is the medical sociology flagship journal at the ASA, and has also published in top journals such as Demography, Social Forces, as well as Social Science and Medicine, amongst others. So without further ado, let me invite Prof. Wen to speak for about half an hour, and so about 30 minutes. And then after which we have a Q&A for another 30 minutes to make up the total 1 hour for this webinar. And in the meantime, to the audience, if you do have questions, please feel free to post your questions on the chat, and I'll see if I can collate the questions for the Q&A. So without further ado, Prof. Wen, please.
Okay, thank you, Vincent, and thank you all for having me here. This is a great opportunity for me to exchange some ideas about these topics. So in this talk, I'm going to focus on patterns, sources, and implications of living arrangements, and particularly among middle-aged and older adults in China. And so I'm focusing on later life and to a lesser extent, middle life, mainly because of the population aging trends are sweeping many countries in the world. It's almost the most dominant social demographic features we're seeing in the 21st century. And with lots of consequences, like affecting a country's economic growth, patterns of work and retirement, the way that families function, the ability of government and communities helping with the families and older adults. So let me first provide some background information. And China has the largest population size of older adults in the world, and the country's population is still rapidly aging. Based on the most recent census, almost 19% of the country's population is 60 years and above, with 65 or above occupying almost 14% of the population. And so by UN definition, I think China is reaching the definition of the aged society and surpassing the aging phase. So according to them, 21% or above of the population who are 65 years old or older would be counted as like very aged society. And we are totally heading that way. All right, so this figure shows this trend, almost a linearly upward trend in terms of the share of older adults. And by 2050-ish, we're going to see almost the peak of the population segment size of 60 or above, reaching 480 million. And as a result, China's old age dependency ratio has also been linearly increasing. And family has traditionally been the primary source of old age support in China, especially in rural areas where a greater proportion of Chinese older adults reside. And the rapid population aging has been accompanied by lots of other macro and even international forces in terms of social, economic, cultural transformations, and all of them influence the traditional role of family and intergenerational co-residence patterns and even preference, and also support exchanges across generations. There's an urgent need to better understand the living arrangements of older adults in contemporary China and how they may impact their health and well-being, both in the short and in the long run. So I'm going to first continue to talk about the patterns and trends of living arrangements, and then briefly discuss contextual factors contributing to these differences across time, and more focus on implications, basically causes and consequences of living arrangements in China for middle-aged and older adults. So a little bit more about the trends. On average, these numbers show a downward trend in terms of the average size of households in China, and decreased from on average 5.6 persons per household in the 1930s to 3.1 persons per household in 2010. And the proportion of older adults living alone or living with spouse only has increased substantially in the 20-year period from 1990 to 2010, according to findings from this article authored by Zeng and Wang. And basically, the proportions of older adults living with children have declined substantially. And basically, the co-residence with children remains to be the largest group, but the trend is very clear that living independently, this is a growing trend. And living with children or grandchildren, the prevalence of co-residence is going down, although it remains to be the most prevalent living arrangement in China. Okay, so this table provides a rural-urban stratified picture, and the general message here is that these trends are applicable to both rural and urban China. And so the decline has occurred at a relatively slower speed in rural than in urban areas over the last 20-year period. Basically, so you can see the decrease is approximately 21% in terms of the share of living with children in rural areas, and 25% in urban areas. So slightly lower, but the general trends remain to be the same. Okay, so that article only stopped in last census, but in the most recent census, the pictures are remaining to be the same. Still living with both spouse and children, living with children. The total number of prevalence is almost 50%. And living alone, without caregiver is approximately 12%. So this is a non-trivial segment in today's older age living arrangement in China. Okay, so another type of living arrangement, traditionally not studied that much, but increasingly prevalent as well. This is living independently, but close to adult children. And so basically, almost 34%. So the prevalence rate is 30%, living in independence, but close to children. Moving towards independence, but maybe living in proximity with children, there's still a high percentage of older adults that prefer to live with their adult children. Here, for this survey data, it's 44%, but I've seen prevalence rates like preferred living with children, almost 50%, and sometimes even more than 50%, and a slightly higher preference for living with adult sons. And actual living arrangements do not always reflect of both choices, and actually very often constraints as well. So, but the majority of older adults can match their preferences, although I wouldn't say this is like a predominantly majority figure. So 64% of the older adults, they can match their living arrangement preference. Okay, this is a very busy table, but basically the messages are here. Co-residence with older children decreased from 63% in 1998 to 46% in 2014, and independent living arrangements increased. And this is the most important message from this study. The increase was more salient among people aged 80 to 89, and the extreme old, aged 90 or above, including more than 100 years, they're still more likely to maintain traditional living arrangements. Okay, so I guess this is a comparative picture.
This one looks good.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, sorry. So basically, our co-residence rate is lower than lots of countries, but higher than other countries. And the countries that have higher co-residence rates are probably slightly lower and slower in terms of development. And for male, the only exception is Iran. So we do have higher co-residence rates, but still we do have lower co-residence rates than Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan, but higher one than Iran in terms of females. So generally speaking, development level and co-residence are correlated negatively across countries. All right, so I'm going to quickly go over these, but not really showing each slide. So basically, contextual factors driving changing patterns of living arrangements includes lots of things, such as policy. And we all know one-child policy in China contributed directly to living arrangements, and also economic development, urbanization, migration, and increased globalization, of course, and even information explosion and in the deep penetration of internet. All of these kind of macro forces certainly contribute to the changing patterns. So let's just go to the laws, regulations, they all matter. And I just wanted to show you the cultural changes play a very important role, especially increase the acceptance and preference of individualism and autonomy. And this is also an important like argument and sometimes even finding that the child has become the center of the family, and the significance of the older generation has been declining. But the filial piety as a dominant cultural system remains to be a prevailing norm. And if you look at the preference of older adults, living with adult children and grandchildren, it remains to be the most preferred living arrangement. Okay, so these are also very important contextual factors. Family changes. We're seeing declined marriage, increase divorce rate, delayed marriage, and all of these have caught media actually attention. Okay, just a second. Okay, and okay, so like all of these headlines, like average delay, and it's not necking. Why China's young adults are refusing marriage. Okay, and so all of these kind of changes contribute to the the patterns of living arrangements. Housing certainly played a very important role, because if there's no additional housing, if there's no room for the older adults to live alone, the living alone living arrangement is just no way to increase. And I wanted to focus a little bit more on the implications of living arrangements on the health and well-being outcomes of older adults. Okay, so the implications can be on a wide variety of health and well-being outcomes. And here are just several examples, like cognitive health, psychological well-being, functional limitation, biomarkers, sleep, and we can easily add a mortality here. So, we probably can imagine that the same kind of living arrangement may have differential and sometimes even opposite effects on different kinds of health-related outcomes. So we've conducted several articles, studies, examining different kinds of outcomes. So for this study, we particularly focus on living alone, because living alone has been on the rise in China and elsewhere in the world, and increasingly studied in most recent literature. So we looked at the association between living alone and cognitive and psychological health, like several years later, and also examined some moderating effects. And the theoretical perspectives about the living alone effects on health can be complex, because there can be both pros and cons. In terms of the benefits, living alone can just force a person to do everything, himself, or most of the things. And so the independent living ability probably will be strengthened, because you just have lots of opportunities to sharpen your skills. Even like spatial skills, you have to move around yourself. Lots of Western-based studies found living alone doesn't mean aging alone, and living alone sometimes is possibly correlated with social participation outside of family. And on the other hand, we believe humans are socially oriented, and living alone can be positively correlated with feeling lonely. And feeling lonely is itself a psychological risk factor for a range of physical health problems. And living with adult children, grandchildren can give a person possibly more sense of usefulness and maybe more sense of purpose and immediate support from family. So theoretical expectations can be ambivalent. And most Western-based studies found negative consequences of living alone. So basically, we used the data from the China family panel studies and focused on depressive symptoms as psychological health measure, and word and mass test scores as cognitive measures. And what we found were some interactive patterns. So for depressive symptoms, it seems like if you're married, it's probably fine if you're living alone, and there's not much difference in terms of depressive symptoms between living alone and not living alone among the married. But if you're not married, so among the unmarried, regardless of the reasons of being unmarried, living alone is indeed related to increased level of depressive symptoms compared to those not living alone. So this is for cognitive test, math test. And for this, there's a gender-based moderation. So for females, it seems like, again, the outcome is math test score. Female older adults living alone have a slightly higher math scores than those females living with others. This difference is actually not statistically significant. But for men, the living alone deficit is very clear. So but only for math score test. And on verbal test, we didn't find any significant effect. And this is another paper on disability. We were using different kind of data source and asking whether living arrangements are associated with loss of disability. And we did look at other kinds of living arrangements, but including living alone as well. So basically, we found some very strong positive effects of living alone. protective effects, I would say, protective effects against the disability. So living alone was associated with the lowest odds of ADL and IADL disability. And living with spouse only and living with skipped generation households sometimes show benefits, but not consistently. So we basically run 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 cross-sectional analysis, and because we also wanted to see a little bit trends, in terms of this relationship. So in some years, they exhibit some benefits, but not consistently. But living alone consistently showed benefits across the years, and not much difference across time. And these several living arrangements consistently showed deficits. And what's the most surprising one is living with adult children only. And this is actually not the first time I saw this kind of risk factor, like a negative health effect of living with adult children only without grandchildren. And I just feel it's a very interesting finding, a little bit surprising, but needs to be further studied. So when you don't have grandchildren in the households and older adults only live with older adult children, sometimes this whole household, we can categorize it as an elderly household. And that kind of phenomena, like if the adult children are 65 and the older generation is more than 90, and this kind of special households is also on the rise in terms of prevalence because of the increased longevity, and has not been studied that much yet. Okay, so I'll just skip this. Generally speaking, we also looked at the trends. So moving towards independence and moving towards dependence have implications for disability as well. And this is another study, Professor Dr. Gu and colleagues conducted, also focusing on solo living. I just would mainly want to focus on the mortality effect. So basically, they found that solo living is negatively correlated with the odds of disability, cognitive impairment, and mortality. So because most of the studies are not examining mortality, and mortality is, some people can argue the most ultimate health measure. They found very strong evidence to show living alone has some benefits protective against mortality. They also actually examined the causes or the predeterminants of living alone, and confirming that living alone is not randomly distributed, but correlated or predetermined by lots of factors here. And one interesting factor here is that actually, if you are more economically independent, you're less likely to be living alone. And if you're living in the city, you're less likely to be living alone. So a side or indirect implication here is that maybe among many living alone older adults in China, it's possible more than not, they live alone not because of choice, but because of constraints. Okay, so we also examined the skipped generation household living. This is also a relatively less studied, and basically just quickly in terms of the theoretical perspectives, there can be role strain versus role enhancement. So again, the expected consequences of living in skipped generation households can also be ambivalent. If you are wearing lots of hats, you are carrying lots of social roles, and if these social roles are conflicting, it's possibly stressful for you, right? The chronic stress, we all know, has lots of negative health consequences. But meanwhile, you're wearing lots of hats, and these roles are not necessarily conflicting, and then maybe your purpose of life is strengthened, and especially when you're conducting culturally sanctioned activities, like you're taking care of grandchildren, especially when your adult children cannot take care of them, maybe because they're conducting economically productive things like as migrant workers in the cities, and then the effects can be beneficial. But so basically what we found is that our finding, at least from this sample, from this study, is that the role string theory is confirmed empirically here, at least in terms of happiness. So here we used a single item on a scale of 1 to 10, how happy you are. So living in skipped generation households is negatively correlated with self-reported happiness among grandparents. So the sample was only focused on grandparents. Okay, so let me skip all of them because I know time is run. And these are other people's finding. Basically, some mixed findings, and this article per se, didn't find lots of evidence about the effect of living in skipped generation households. And for this one, this is a more recently published article and focusing on biomarkers. And so they're not diseases yet. They're you can consider them as like a pre-morbid outcomes. And for them, they are like measured outcomes. They also didn't find much effect of either living alone or skip generation living. So basically these studies, and there are many other kinds of studies, more or less focusing on different kinds of outcomes and different kinds of living arrangements. But generally speaking, so living alone has mixed effects on health. It depends on what kind of health outcomes we offer, and co-residence living can have some benefits, but it also depends on what outcome. Sometimes the benefits are not very clear. So this is a work in progress, but I'm not going to focus on this. So we're talking about sleep this time, and we haven't published this article yet. So basically, we use the intergeneration living with spouse and with spouse only, and then compare with different kinds of living arrangement there. Okay, so just in conclusion from this work in progress, we found advantage of living with spouse, and that's very clear. And a great disadvantage of living alone. Again, now in this study, we're focusing on sleep-related outcomes, both in terms of the duration, hours, and in terms of the likelihood of like having sleep deprivation. Okay, so basically, I want to quickly summarize this literature so that we actually have seen most studies, at least the China-based studies, are using these 4 data sets. CHNS, CLHLS, CFPS, and CHOLS. And one of the future research directions, it may be to do some new data collection. So on living arrangement and health, I would say certain living arrangements remain to be less studied. Like what I said, like in terms of the skipped generation living, and I found a few studies, but we probably need more to understand them better. And living with adult children only is worth further examination. And also married but living apart. There's a trend in Europe actually increasing, and not just for older people, but also for younger people, being married but living apart. And this is also a non-trivial prevalent living arrangement in China, and living close to children, and particularly this kind of like old age migrants. They live in the cities. They're originally from rural areas. They now live in the cities with their adult children, and how they're doing. And there's very little evidence about them. And we also need more research to examine the causal pathways, like the mechanisms. And Dr. Goose and colleagues' paper touched that a little bit. So they focused on mortality. One of the outcomes they focused on wasn't mortality, but they only examined the mediating effects for mortality. And they found social participation was a very important mechanism to explain why living alone was a protective factor of mortality. So more of those kind of studies need to be conducted. And certainly to trying to understand more about the moderating and mediating effects. And mixed method studies are also important to better understand the more in-depth stories about each living arrangement. There are so many different kinds of circumstances, motivations for each living arrangement. Like for living alone, why do they become like solo livers? And are they motivated? Are they constrained? Do they prefer the matching between personal preferences and living arrangements? That's certainly a very important topic as well. And ultimately, we really want to design and implement intervention studies to better help our like older adults. And I also want to like generally share some ideas about future directions on health and aging research in China, and not just focus on the living arrangement part. So there are several research topics I think it will be exciting to see more research on. So first of all, I would love to see more research on the daily activities of older Chinese, and maybe stratified by age groups, and just what they do on a regular basis, daily regular basis. Where do they go, like activity space, and to better document China's digital divide, and particularly among senior citizens. And this is an increasingly important factor contributing to people's health and well-being, and particularly among older people. And to better understand the service needs for elders living independently to facilitate aging in space. And this is also a very interesting topic. What's going on with their continued education? Are they interested in continued education opportunities? And what can we do to promote lifelong learning? And will lifelong learning really benefit older adults' quality of life and longevity, etc.? And most importantly, lots of older adults, yes, they're probably less energetic when they're younger, but they're still very healthy, very interested in participating in social life. And how can we better leverage of older adults' cultivated resources? And we kept saying we see the growing trend of individualism, the preference of autonomy, but I would love to see more studies directly trying to understand, explore the trends of societal norms of aging, and examining some cohort effects down the road. And as I mentioned, that possibly it's time to do more new data collection, because all of the data, like the 4 data sets started a long time ago, they're still ongoing. But if we say are interested in understanding the current middle age, then we probably needed to collect new data. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank
and
you.
So sorry again for the,
Thank you, Prof. Hun. Sorry to have to rush this. Yeah, but we
I'm so
have
sorry.
but we have 20 minutes, good 20 minutes for Q&A, and maybe we can even take a bit longer. So can I invite anyone to pose any questions that you might have to Prof. Hun? So I see Mutsen, you want to start us off?
Yeah. Prof. Hun, thank you very much for this very interesting and comprehensive presentation. Especially, it is very valuable in the end. You pointed to the directions for further development of this field. And so, actually, particularly, you mentioned about the importance to pin down the mechanisms, and so that's also what I have been wondering during your presentation. And so, when we try to compare across different living arrangement, I think one very important aspect that can or have not been well captured is the actual quality of relationship. And so, for example, when comparing older married couple versus those who live alone, it is possible, as you said, some of them is about a forced option, right? And then they don't have the other way around, but some of them, they may actually opt out of a certain arrangement. And then it's a point to a very unique living patterns among the older population, is that now most of them are retired, and so when they're still working, they may spend majority of their daily time outside of home. And now when this interactions with the spouse, with the other family members are becoming so overwhelming and intense in a way, it is possible to result in more conflicts and this like a lower relationship quality. And so I'm wondering, especially if they live in a multi-generation like family, like particularly regarding like how to make parenting decisions for the third generation, and that could also be about not just the added like a role strain as you mentioned, but also this potential like a heightened level of family conflicts. And so I'm wondering like your thought on this. Thank you.
Thank you. I think you raised a very important question and comment, like the quality of relationship. And actually, none of the studies I reviewed touch on that, mainly because of data limitation. So for the new data collection effort, if ever, we should definitely ask that question, because this is actually a big question for marriage related studies, and not necessarily living arrangements for older people, but generally there's a big literature on marital status and health, right? And so the quality of relationship matters so much for marriage that on average we see marital benefits. But some studies have emerged to show that, you know, poor marriage is actually pretty bad for children even. You know, children can benefit from their parents' divorce if their parents constantly fight. So that's actually a possibly one angle when we design intervention studies down the road. And so we first of all need to have more data on that and to really say, of course, I believe if the family relationship is so beautiful and living together can be absolutely beneficial. But what if we only have mediocre or average? And would we still benefit from living together? So that kind of more nuanced picture we don't have. We need more data to understand that. But no matter what, I think the intervention study can be even to offer help to train, like to promote family relationship quality and to gain perspectives from all parties in the family. And I personally think that can be a potentially promising intervention study direction down the road.
Thank you.
Thank you. Daniel, you want to pose your question?
Yeah, forgive me. I'm coming to you from outer space. It's after midnight in the U.S. right now. Terrific presentation. I learned a lot. Thank you so much. You mentioned policy issues in your presentation. You may know that I've worked with the numbers here, and in terms of averted population, the numbers are really gigantic based on the best cited counterfactual model that I know of birth rates in the absence of all of China's birth limitation programs. It's about 600 million is the shortfall in China's population. And if I'm doing the calculations correctly, since the program started in 1970 with the precursor of Wan Xizhao, that's everybody under the age of 52. 600 million fewer potential caregivers there. And this is kind of on my mind. I took part in a discussion last month about China's new direction, its new pronatal direction. They released a policy paper in 2021 saying that they're going to sort of revert to or start a pronatal program, and I think that's supposed to be finished in 2025. So I'm just thinking about all these things. I know that there's a question here. There seems to be a kind of collapse in the state of marriage right now in China. Nobody seems to want to get married. First births are going way down. And then they have this new pronatal program. So how do all these things, what's the relevance of all these issues for living arrangements in your view?
So very interesting observation, and certainly very applicable to China. That's one thing I'm not entirely sure about the causes of the current, the so-called marriage crisis. Is it really true that people no longer prefer marriage as much as before? Or is marriage remains to be the most preferred norm of living with children? It's just by constraint for all sorts of reasons, including motivation in labor market participation. That just in reality, that's why towards the end, I wanted to I only mentioned the aging, the societal norms on how do older people look at themselves? How do their children look at them, right? And that's one thing. Another thing is that how do young people really look at marriage? And so the media certainly picked that up, and then there are all sorts of speculations and ask some people to comment, but I want to see systematic studies. And I suspect it's probably still true that most people prefer getting married, maybe delayed because they want to experience more, but in the end, so what can the society do to help promote the more matching between preferred living and realistic living for all sorts of population segments, including both young people and older people? So that's one thing. Another thing is that in terms of caregiver, and there's absolutely a big issue in China, and the research is so lagged behind on caregivers. And actually in Hong Kong, we started collecting data on 3,000 caregivers in Hong Kong, just trying to understand their feelings, quality of life. Many of them are depressed themselves. They need a lot of help too. I'm sure they do this out of their own, values or love for their family members in need. But still, perhaps the community, the government, the society can still help with them. But I personally see caregiver-related research is a very promising future direction on health and aging realm in China. And first of all, we need to collect data to understand them better, both qualitative and quantitative data. But meanwhile, the US has already advanced in terms of caregiver-related research. My own colleagues in the US, actually, they started doing intervention study designs. And for one example, to focus on how do caregivers, and they focus on caregivers of dementia-related family members. They wanted to understand how do they spend time in their spare time. Can we help them better manage time available to them, whenever they have a little bit leisure time for themselves? So that's just the one angle, but I would love to see more research conducted in China. And we started a little bit in Hong Kong, but hopefully we can collaborate with China-based scholars. We're scholars interested in China along those kind of lines as well.
Thank you.
Prof. Wen, just to follow up on Daniel's question and your comments about decreasing marriage, and you said that this is due to structural conditions, and they want to, but they cannot for whatever reason. But then there's another part of the presentation where you talk about a cultural shift and the desire for individualism. So actually, the decline in marriage, is it due to structural conditions, or is it, something that's also to do with culture and the growing desire for independence and so on?
I think these are very good questions that need to be studied. I can offer some theoretical speculations, but we need to study them to better understand the China-specific stories, right? So I personally think both are important. Both structural changes and cultural changes are important. But even in the US, which is a very advanced economy, individualism obviously is more dominant than that we see in China. But even there's a trend, which is the likelihood of getting married is possibly correlated with educational attainment, meaning that more socio-economically successful segment of population still prefer marriage, right? So that's sort of like indirectly speaking to the possibility of marriage constraint theory or perspective. That's the US story. But in China, there's a phenomenon called NEET, right? So lots of young people, they're not working, they're not looking for jobs, they're not studying, they're not getting training, they're just staying at home with their parents, mostly playing games or just hanging out there. So they're not necessarily satisfied or something, but they are in this limbo status. And so this reminds me, this phenomena, which is increasingly prevalent in recent years in China, probably due to the pandemic. We will see the trends, how the trends pan out later on. But this phenomenon reminds me of William Wilson's The Truly Disadvantaged observation or theory, that when people start losing employment jobs, especially according to his observation in the 1980s, like the African-American men, when they started losing jobs, the maritable pool for men will be depleting, right? Like, or at least declining to some extent. And that certainly affects the marital status, the marital marriage rate to some extent as well. And so that's possibly one perspective that needs to be studied, and that's a theoretical perspective, needs to be empirically tested, is that because of the increasing prevalence of these young people who are not being employed, who or they only work for temporary jobs. They're not even ambitious enough to look for a full-time job. So first of all, we want to understand this youth segment or young adult segment. How many are there? Like, are they just here temporarily? Really, how temporary they plan to be? You know, that kind of, we don't have that kind of information yet. Say this is a slightly more long-term arrangement. It's going to affect the marriage market as well. And this segment is not just, I don't know about the gender distribution in this, but no matter whether we have more men or more women, they will affect marriage rate. And especially if we have disproportionately more young men in this segment, that's a structural. And cultural, yes, there is increased preference for independence, individualism, but they're not necessarily, affecting, getting married per se. But that would affect people's getting pickier, and especially in the information explosive era, in internet penetration era, people may get pickier, and because you have so many, role models, images, and lots of rosy and artificially rosy pictures on the internet. Would that affect people's preference for, getting married? Means getting settled. That's a major life event, right? So are people becoming less committed or more hesitant, in terms of decision making about that? So those are some speculations. I think the interesting research questions themselves.
Thank you so much. Any other questions from anyone? Actually, Prof. Wen, I do have another question if I could.
Sure.
Yeah. So one of the results actually shows that that there is a, let me see I wrote it here. So living alone actually decreases the odds of disability. And that was what you found. But actually it might be a causal issue, right? Because people who are not disabled then have the option of living alone because they are able to fend for themselves and so on, look after themselves and so on. So it's a question of causality. Is it that living alone improves mobility, or is it the presence of mobility actually makes it possible for someone to live alone? Yeah. And likewise for cognitive.
I think both.
Yeah. So that's my question.
Yes, cognitive impairment is sometimes we can even also reframe it as part of disability. It's just both. Disability can come from both cognitive impairment and physical impairment, right? So I believe both selection and causation coexist. Just like a socioeconomic status and health, both matter. But for socioeconomic status and health, there seems to be increasingly agreed consensus that perhaps causation plays a bigger role. And for living alone and health, and particularly the two health outcomes we mentioned, the disability and mortality, which force plays a bigger role or not, we don't know for sure yet. But from Dr. Gu's study, they actually tested both. They tested the selection, they also tested causation, and their conclusion is yes, both existed. And when they examined the they attempted to examine the causal effect of living alone on disability and mortality, they used the longitudinal data. They controlled for baseline disability, and they still found the beneficial effect of living alone on both disability from both cognitive and functional limitations and mortality. So these are hard health outcomes, not subjective feeling related outcomes. But for subjective feeling related outcomes, we also consistently see that living alone has some deficits. Like people don't feel that good when they live alone. Maybe they can fare better in terms of physiology, but not emotional. So quality of life is hard to say because it depends on so many things, and physical measures, physical aspects matter as well. So I just tend to believe that both are important, but there might be a causal influence, causal benefit of living alone, especially on things that on outcomes that are dependent on your frequent practice, like your brain. You have to use your brain over and over again. But some people argue that if you live with others, you also need to practice your brain. You need to fight with them. You need to talk to them. They argue with them. So that's an interesting argument too.
Yeah. Actually, I really enjoy what you said just now, when you said that living alone doesn't necessarily mean aging alone, because you may be living alone, but you have connections to people, friends, and family outside the family, outside their household. So I think that distinction would be important. And I think in terms of future research directions, you did mention the internet and social media. It'd be interesting to think about aging as not just aging within the home, but also aging in social networks, and how people are using technology and so on to despite living alone, they're using these technologies to reach out to others that are living outside the household. It actually enhance their well-being. Yeah. Sorry, I have a question here from Xing Yi. Xing Yi, do you want to pose your question?
Yes, thank you, Prof. Thank you, Prof. Wen, for this very fantastic presentation. I have a follow-up question that is very similar to Prof. Tra's question about what you said about living alone does not necessarily mean aging alone. I really like that claim too. So this also has something to do with some thoughts that I have been thinking a lot for a very long time. That what does it mean to be solo living for older adults themselves? For example, maybe when we think of living alone, we might thought of them as being miserable and do not interact with other people, but maybe older adults also enjoy their solo living time because they can enjoy other social participation with their friends. And on the other hand, I also wonder what does it mean to live with family members to older adults? Because on the one hand, older adults can enjoy great time to unite with their family members. They also sometimes, especially when they are healthy, they also need to provide a lot of care to their family members. So in this regard, I also wonder, Prof is gone.
Oh yeah, she's okay.
Okay.
She has joined me in outer space.
I think let's wait for her to come back.
Sure.
Yeah. And then let's wrap up this webinar. Yeah.
Yes.
What time is it over there, Daniel? Okay, we just continue. Yeah, just continue.
Yes, sure.
Sorry.
Yes. Sorry, I don't know which part you left.
I'm sorry.
I think you got part of the question at least, Prof Wen. Do you want to respond to?
You were going to talk about living alone and aging alone, and then I just got disconnected.
Sure.
Okay.
Then let me make it quick. So my question is mainly about, I wonder what does older adults themselves think about solo living and living with family members? Like, for example, living with family members might bring them a lot of joy, but they also especially when they are healthy, they also need to provide a lot of care to their family members. And on the other hand, solo living may not be so misery as we might think it of, because older adults may have more time to engage in leisure activities or engage in social participation with their friends, right? And I also wonder if different cohorts of other adults will have different perceptions regarding solo living. Like, yeah, so that's my question. Thank you.
Thank you.
I completely agree. I think what they prefer matters a lot too. So we found most people still prefer co-residence, but the majority is small, like 50% of older adults prefer co-residence. And I would say the level of variation is particularly huge among the living alone relative to other kinds of living arrangements, because there can be all sorts of circumstances leading to this living arrangement. So it really matters whether living alone is what you prefer. So the match, particularly important for this group of people. But it's still important for us to understand if you have to live alone, because sometimes realistically this is the only way you can carry on. But then what can we do to help from scholars, from society, from program, and in terms of educational opportunities, what can we tell these people who are forced to live alone? What kind of societal community resources we can offer? And you mentioned the internet. Many times we don't need to have physical, a coexistence in a space, right? A communication, socialization can occur via WeChat easily via all sorts of other things. But this is an important topic to be further studied too.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. So, Prof. Wen, thank you for taking the time to speak with us and to share your research. I think let's call it a day.
Thank you.
Certainly, Daniel needs to.
Okay.
It's 1 a.m. where he is. So, shall we show our appreciation to Prof. Wen? And thank you, everybody. I wish everyone a very good weekend ahead. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I apologize again for my
It's all right.
internet problem. Okay, bye.
Bye.